G'day everyone. Thank you for the first talk there. This kind of ties in a little bit. So obviously after the first talk you should now have your team and stuff already. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about working with clients. It's something that I do quite a lot, and I will go into a little bit of about me. Does the clicker work? No, I'll press the keyboard. That's all right. Let's look at that, smooth transitions. So who am I? Well, I'm Michael Matthews. Some people may know me as Mikey. So my kind of story is that I studied a Cert 2 and Cert 3 while I was in high school, doing an art course and then a game design course through AIE respectively, which allowed me to graduate high school in year 11 and pass my SACE and whatnot, which allowed me to start my advanced diploma. So it all flowed together. So I've recently just come out of doing my advanced diploma in game design, and during the second year of that I founded my own studio, Classy Bogan Studios, with a mate of mine. We started off with a team of 2 and we've now expanded onto a team of 8, and what we do is kind of virtual reality solutions for clients. We're freelance virtual reality developers. We've worked with people like VR Adelaide. We did do a project for Hybrid World while studying. That was with the same team, although still under the banner of AIE technically. We're currently doing work with UniSA, and to update the list, we're doing some work with NAC and NAPA, which are 2 Indigenous kind of government sectors that work out off of the kind of York Peninsula area. I've got a few of my hobbies and interests up there, such as, obviously, I dabble in a little bit of programming. I started off doing programming for our team, but I've kind of let that off to our actual programmers now, which is probably a wise choice considering I'm a designer. I play a bit of guitar, and some people may know me for my stories about working at Bunnings, which is pretty exciting too. So what are we going to be covering today? So we're going to be covering what are these fantastic beasts known as clients, and where do we find them? And I'm also going to be going over the equipment you might need for your first interaction, what that first interaction with a client should look like, and then your next and beyond. So going into more about developing a project for a client and what those interactions and meetings should look like and sort of be structured with. Before I begin, I just want to say if anybody has any questions at any point during this, do feel free to ask. I'm not afraid to kind of stop and answer anything on the go. James?
How the heck did you go from a team of 2 to a team of 8?
Well, we found needs within the projects, and the way that we the structure the costs of our projects based on a client thing, it just means that there's less money given to individual people. It's just the roles are spread out a little bit more to make it eventually a more polished product in the end. We figured we could benefit more from having more in the long term from having a larger team of people to make better projects than having a smaller team of people but our projects not being as good. Because if we have better quality in our projects, then we've got more stuff to show off on our portfolio that we can then attract bigger and better clients in the future. We kind of saw that as a very long-term, very kind of progressive thing in that term. It is kind of leaving us a little short-handed in the short term, but everyone in our team has a secondary job, which allows us to keep up with those overheads as well. So there's that. So I'll go into a little bit about what is a client. So what is a client? Well, a client is anyone. Thank you, that's my talk. I'll see you guys all next week. No, so clients are pretty much anyone, but there's a few particular sectors where you'll find your game developer skills to kind of come into play really handy. So one of those is training. So the training sector is a really big one if you're doing virtual reality like I am. It's all the rage right now. So I just recently did a Cert 4 in training where pretty much it was the best networking I've ever done, because I went there and by the end of it, so we had to do a few presentations on what we do. And at the end of it, I think I handed out a good 6 or 7 business cards to people that all wanted to get their training that they currently do gamified in some way, shape or form. So if you're looking at freelancing, training is a really big one.
Have you found any customers, essentially they had a broken app or something, and essentially they've been like, we need you to fix this, this is essentially what we have, it's broken, can you remake this?
Well, not us in particular. But we have had, because gamifying things is only a very new idea to the whole training sector. It's only been happening it's been rolling out for the last maybe 2 years in the more progressive companies, and it's starting to become more mainstream, more common. But yeah, so there aren't really enough training application or games out there for people to be kind of fixing them up. And I haven't seen too much freelance work, at least coming our way, where we've been fixing applications in that regard. The other sector that's a big one, especially, I'm going to talk a lot about VR because that's what my team and I specialize in, but this does correlate to all of them, is travel as well. So travel is a massive target if you're looking at making experiences and gamifying things. Because the thing that separates travel agencies and stuff like that is how much you can immerse someone in an experience before you get them to go and undertake it. That's why they have travel agents going out and giving reviews and all the rest of it. And one thing they've been doing recently is they've been doing virtual tours of different places that you may travel to. I've seen some really nice ones for Dubai and stuff like that, where you'd put on a 360 headset or you'd look at it on your device, and you'd be able to like experience what it's like to stay there for a week in a matter of minutes, just because you've been able to have a bit of a look around at a 360 video on your phone, essentially. But they're kind of getting more and more into looking at on-flight stuff as well. I know that a lot of travel agencies are looking at that kind of thing, where they're looking at developing things specifically related to their company. Qantas has a new thing out, I can't remember what it was called, but that's also a part of their whole gamification progress. And the final one is events. Events is a huge one. So events is probably the easiest one to network to as well. So if you go to an event, you can generally find an event coordinator and they'll go, hey, this is what we do, this is the marquees we have set up, and you would apply pretty much like anybody else would to get a spot at that event. And it's really good for networking, as a lot of the people that are displayed at AvCon would have seen. But developing stuff for smaller events is probably the easier way to go. I know we've put in applications for the Fringe earlier this year. We didn't get it, unfortunately, but it is definitely a viable path for people to take in that regard. So now that we know what clients are, where are they? Where do we find these cheeky little buggers? So we find them everywhere. Okay, thank you, I'm done. We find them, you can find them at expos and stuff. Like the Tertiary Careers Expo is a really great one for finding clients for training, just because there's so many different trainers out there. And when you're looking for clients, you want to be looking for people that don't already have the skills that you do. So if you're looking for your clients to be other game developers, you're probably looking in the wrong place. You want to look at places where you would think that have never even touched a gaming console before, because they're the people that would need you the most. I'll talk about this a little bit more on this next point of being on site with them. So if you found somewhere like that, like for example, our first ever job that myself and Booker applied for in this industry was, we currently work at Bunnings, and Bunnings is one of the places where they still use CDs to run their music through the store. I don't know how many people actually still use CDs anymore, and they hand out actual printed off letters to everyone. There's no kind of Bunnings email that goes around. So for the technologically challenged, jumping into VR was a big step for them, but it was one they were willing to take because they knew that their industry was particularly lacking in that field. So if you can kind of identify those gaps, it is really useful to go out to their sites, ask if you can speak to a manager, put on your old Karen haircut and see how you go. Go out and speak to a manager and go, hey, these are the skill sets that we have. This is how this could benefit your business. And I'll talk about a little bit more about those first interactions in just a moment. And did I just skip one there? There we go. So the final one is events. So going out to the events and talking to the event coordinators, as I mentioned previously. All right, so I'm going to be talking about your everyday inventory. So when you see the stuff show up on here, I just want everyone to kind of double check to make sure that you've actually got that stuff on you at the moment. So you'll notice three things up here, and pretty much all three of these can be covered with the phone, but that would be really boring if I had three pictures of a phone up here. So essentially, you want to have some way of showing people your portfolio. You want to get your portfolio on the road. So for me, that looks like my website. So I'm able to access my website from my phone at any point in time, and that's got my major projects on there that I want to show to clients before getting involved with them. For other people, that can look like demos of your game if you've got mobile games, videos of your games and stuff like that. I also like to use our professional chats in the team. So we've got a Discord server where we have work in progress channel where we can go over and we can just look at things as people are going on, and particularly art stuff is really good to show off that we like to have on our portfolio there to be able to pretty much show at any given point in time. The second one is your contact details. So that's a really big one, because if you go and you meet with a client and you have a fantastic first interaction with them, and then you leave and they got no way of contacting you, well, you've just wasted both of your times, essentially. So this can be in the form of business cards, is a really good one. I've got business cards on me at the moment, and I imagine anyone that's freelancing should pretty much have business cards on them at any given point in time. But this can also be in the form of, if you've got like a website and it's really easy to Google search, like for us, if you Google Classy Bogan Studios, we're the first thing that shows up. I made sure of that by hunting down all of our competition. Yeah, so being able to direct people to a website, a Facebook page, or some way of being able to get into contact you is super important. And your final thing, which will show up quite a bit, get used to this picture, it shows up another one time in the presentation, is your notebook. So it is really important to have a notebook or some form of taking notes with you at any given point in time, because if you're exchanging details to a client, they're going to be exchanging details back to you, which is really important to be able to take note of that. So whether that's on your phone with your notes, that's what I tend to do, is after I've spoken to someone and I've walked off down the street a little bit so it doesn't look like I'm texting someone about the meeting, I'll then go and put my notes in about things like who they are, what they work for, where the money is, and stuff like that. Can I just see a show of hands of people that have kind of all three of these things on them at the moment? Fantastic. So everyone who's got your hand up, this slide was completely useless to you then, I see. And for everyone else, you've now learnt something today and you've got something to improve upon when you get home. Awesome. So now I'm going to go through a little bit of a step-by-step of what your first interaction with a client should look like. And after this, I'm going to be going over some tips and some do's and don'ts in this particular situation. So first and most importantly, introduce yourself. It's a very common sense one that people go, duh, when you're starting a conversation, why wouldn't you introduce yourself? But there's quite a few times where you might get caught up in the moment and you might just start talking and you've forgotten to let them know your name, and this can become very detrimental in the conversation, where if someone's trying to talk to you and they've completely forgotten your name because you haven't told it to them, they're going to be reluctant to engage further in that conversation. So it is really important to introduce yourself, as trivial or as much of common sense as that might seem. The second thing is, don't go into talking about yourself too much immediately. Your introduction should just be, hi, my name's Michael, I work for Classy Bogan Studios, or I'm the founder of Classy Bogan Studios. Obviously you guys don't work for Classy Bogan Studios yet. Just wait. But make sure that you're asking about them and keeping your initial introduction to yourself brief, just so that they know just enough information to kind of know who you are. And when you ask about them, it engages with them, and everybody likes talking about themselves. As much as people don't want to admit it, it's what you know the most about, and it's the easiest way to find common ground is to ask about them. And once you know about them, you can generally find some common ground there to get talking. After you've asked about them, generally they'll ask about you, and this is time to show off. Whip out that portfolio and show people the really cool work you've done. It's really important to be confident at this stage and to be able to go, hey, this is some really cool stuff I've done, and really make yourself look as good as possible, probably even better than you actually are. It's a really good time to be able to show that kind of thing off and really blow the socks off of the client with the work you've done so far. The next thing is, the entire time after they've told you about them, you should be thinking about how your skills can play into their particular role. I spoke about this a little bit just earlier. But it is really important to be discussing the benefits to them, because for people that don't know much about your industry, people who don't know much about VR or gamifying things, it won't be extremely clear to them immediately how you can help. And if you can start to get the ball rolling, you'll get into this really good situation where they'll be brainstorming ideas with you. Just earlier tonight, I got a phone call from one of my clients who, after a previous meeting, has been brainstorming ideas on how they can implement VR into their business a little bit better. Which is fantastic, which is what you kind of want to achieve out of these meetings. The last thing, well, the second to last thing, the last thing you'll do when you're interacting with the client face-to-face is you'll exchange details. It's really important to do this last bit, and which is why it's super important to have your business cards or something on you where you can give them a phone number or some way to get back to you afterwards. And the final thing that a lot of people tend to forget is to follow up. If you've just had a really good interaction with a client, and they might have a really busy schedule, you might have a really busy schedule. You've just exchanged details, you've just walked off, and most of the time you might never hear from them again. But if you show that you're keen and you follow up with them, just sending them a quick little email or giving them a phone call going, hey, I really enjoyed our meeting. How about we find another time to catch up again and talk about the possibilities of using this technology in your sector? Most of the time the clients will really like that, and they'll go, yeah, awesome, let's do that. Let's catch up and let's get this meeting involved. And if not, then they weren't really looking at getting involved with you anyway, so no time wasted there, essentially. So a couple of do's and don'ts in this scenario. It is really important to be confident. Remember that you are the expert in most of these situations. So if you're confident and you're able to kind of hold yourself with that kind of air of professionalism, then a client is going to be much more willing to work with you than if you go, yeah, I mean, I could. I might be able to make that for you maybe I'll, yeah. So you want to be really confident in the way that you're speaking and go, yep, that is something that I can definitely look into, and I'll definitely be catching up with you soon. Kind of stuff like that, where you're showing a real air of confidence about you. Asking questions is a big do. Definitely be doing this constantly. So you don't want to just be sitting there like I am now and talking out to everyone like as if it's an audience. You want to really turn it into a conversation and get them to drive the conversation. It was spoken about in the previous talk how precious people can find their own ideas. Well, if you play onto that and you feed the ideas out of the client, they're going to be much more eager to follow those ideas and really pursue them with you in particular. And the final one, which is a really important one, is dress appropriately. I have a funny little story, which is how our kind of business name came about. Was when we were going through our first interview, our first meeting with our boss at Bunnings, discussing virtual reality stuff with him. Essentially, I told my mate to look nice when we showed up, to dress nicely. I showed up in my slacks and a nice t-shirt, because we didn't have these t-shirts at the time. And then my mate showed up in tracksuit pants he's had for 8 years and a jacket with holes in it. So it is really important to really address that air of professionalism and really make sure that you're dressing appropriately for every occasion. So there are a few don'ts that are going to show up as well. So we don't want to over-explain and complicate things. A lot of the time your clients don't know what you're talking about, so you don't want to be talking about the dangers of firing off 6 physics raycasts at the same time on every single delta time frame that deform the environment, because they're not going to understand any of that. And I know a lot of people here might pick up on the joke. Beck, I'm looking at you. But don't be using too many technical terms when you're interacting with a client, because you don't want to be confronting them with that, and you don't want to leave them in a situation where they're confused and they're unable to grasp the kind of positives that you're throwing at them there. The second one is don't give definite yes or no's. You can throw yourself into a really dangerous trap there, where if you go, yes, I can make Skyrim 2 with more content in 10 minutes for about $30, and then they're probably going to hold you to that when you go into the next meeting with them, in terms of making sure that you can deliver around that price frame. It is good to say yes or no if you 100% know something or you've already made something, but at this first stage, everything should be, yeah, no, that's definitely something I'll look into, or just going into more along the lines of it's something you'll do further research on, or it's something that's there's more investigation required, more information needs to be gathered, essentially making sure that they're aware of that, and it's not just that's something, yes, that's happening. And no is just as dangerous, because if you say no, you could turn out a week later you've done a bit of research into it and it turns out that is something that I can do. So after this meeting, it is really good to just be doing your research. And the final one is don't talk price on your first impression. So the biggest thing that will scare a client away, especially when gamifying things, because your prices can get quite up there, is don't talk about this. This is dangerous. On your first interaction, you can give people ballpark figures so they know what they're looking at, but you don't want to be locking yourself into anything. Same with the yes and no. And it's generally a good idea to avoid it in the first interaction, because it's all about building that connection with someone. The more they trust you, you might find in the next meeting that they actually would be able to raise their budget a little bit, because they've been able to connect with you a little bit more, they trust you a little bit more, and therefore they might want to invest a little bit more into you. So you can only benefit from not talking about price in your first interaction. So what about your next interaction? Well, here's the things that you'll need. Essentially, you should have your extensive documentation written out before your next formal interaction, if you've already spoken about a game idea. If not, then this isn't as important in your very next one, but every one after that, you should have your documentation ready and with you, so that you can essentially be talking. You can essentially be showing the client where everything will be within a project, or if you're talking about a particular point of a project, you'll be able to walk through them essentially where everything is in your documentation. The second thing is your plan. Make sure that you have a plan for every meeting you go to. If you don't have a set, agenda of things you want to cover in those meetings can go on for hours, and that's not productive for anyone. So you want to make sure that you've got a plan and you're sticking to that plan the entire way through. That's just a really helpful, really important aspect. And your notebook's back again. That's the last time you'll be seeing that picture. Don't worry about it. I know you're liking it, James. But essentially, make sure you've got a notebook with you or some way of taking notes. I generally don't have a physical notebook with me because I find it hard to concentrate on two things at once, writing down and talking, but I'll always have my phone with me, and immediately after a meeting, I digitize everything, and when I get home, I put it all on my computer. It's not the most productive way. Taking notes physically is probably a better way to do things, but I find it easier to engage in conversation when I'm just engaging in conversation, essentially. If you have someone dedicated to taking minutes, that's fantastic as well. That's probably the best way to go. So a step-by-step walkthrough of every interaction you're pretty much going to have with a client from your first interaction onwards. So you want to start with your greeting again. People do forget names, and it is a big one to make sure that you've kind of fermented it into their head what your name is, so that way, you know, you kind of build that connection a bit more. And same with the other one, it allows them to open up a little bit more and be a little bit more confident to kind of engage with you on the product. Secondly, briefly discuss your meeting plan. This is important so that the client knows what you're going to be talking about. It's like an introduction when you're going into an essay or something like that. You're going, this is the stuff I'm going to be talking about, and by the end of the meeting, this is the stuff that would have been discussed. First and foremost, you should be raising any issues, but not just any issues where you want the client to solve it for you, because the client shouldn't be solving your issues. You want to be presenting them with persist or pivot kind of moments. So you go, hey, I've got an issue with this model isn't particularly turning out the way I want it to, or this asset you've provided me isn't working the way I want it to. We can alter the application or program to work this way, and it'll still achieve your goal, but it works around the problem that we've just faced. So you want to be presenting them with a kind of a pair of solutions for them to choose between, rather than forcing them to go through all the technical hard yards of solving your problem for you, essentially. It's also really important to talk about these first, because people hold on to the negatives. So if you talk about your positives first, then you go into your negatives, they're going to walk away with just the negatives. If you then go on to your second part, which is talking about the things that are going well in your project, and this is always really important. If you've got a game build of your project, which I should have mentioned in the previous slide, is something to bring along. If you've got a game build, some kind of demo, it's really good to present it afterwards, so then you can go, well, hey, these are the things we know what's wrong, but have a look, jump in and see what we got. We're really proud of what we've got so far. Here's our work in progress tab on our Discord that you can kind of have a bit of a scroll through and have a look at all the different cool stuff we've been putting together. And going through those positives really allows the client to have a positive takeaway when they come out of it, even if you've had a few negatives to mention with them. After you've spoken about the positives, it's really important to ask the client for whatever you need from them. Give them as much time as possible. If you're talking about this, it is really good to give them a kind of heads up in an email or a discussion prior to the meeting about pretty much anything you might need from them, so then they can get ready and prepare themselves and formulate a plan to kind of get that for you, essentially. And then finally, give them a bit of a summary of everything you've spoken about. I like to think of it as a nice, well-written essay. You kind of close everything right at the bottom, and then you'll talk about what's next. So discuss with the client. If you've got a bit of time after following your plan, because if you followed your plan and you've got a client that's got 2 hours allocated, you've covered all the stuff you need to cover in an hour and a half. You've now got half an hour to kind of sit there and talk with the client about the project, and you've got their kind of undivided attention to just kind of discuss things and build that relationship and build that connection, because a lot of your work as a freelancer will come from the same client. If you've done your job well enough, it will be repeat work where they want to come back to you, whether it's in the same year, whether it's the following year, whether it's in the next week kind of thing, will vary. But generally, if you've built a good enough connection with the client, they will keep coming back to you, as we've seen where we've got quite a lot of our work out of VR Adelaide, who've been fantastic for us. So the do's and don'ts of this one. So once again, be confident. Even when you're talking about things that are wrong with your project, just make sure you've always got a plan for that kind of thing, and that you're confident in those plans or those solutions, so that the client can also be confident that they're making the right choice by going with those plans or solutions that you present to them. Bring a build. So I did remember that. Yeah, so bring a build is a big one. If you've got a demo to show off, that is huge to bring to a client so they can really visualize what you're discussing and what you're talking about. Even if nothing's really changed from the previous build, you might be talking about different topics where they can jump into it and look at and kind of visualize where different things will be implemented in the project in the future. And the final one, continue to dress appropriately. Just because you're buddies with the client doesn't mean you can start showing up in your tracky pants and holes in your jumpers. Make sure that you do dress appropriately, and you treat it like almost like a job interview every single time. So when you're dressing, think, would I wear this to a job interview with this very same person? I don't know. So show up with your slacks and your nice shirt, or I represent your business if you can. Like I found that getting shirts printed off was really helpful because it kind of gets your branding out there as you're walking to and from meetings, but it also gives you something consistent to wear that the client can expect, essentially. So a couple of the don'ts. Once again, don't over-explain or overcomplicate things. If you have a technical issue, try and explain it in as many layman's terms as possible. Instead of telling someone that you've got problems with your physics raycasts and your poly count is too high and all those kind of things that a client might not understand, just say, hey, we're having some problems with the coding. This is the effect that's going to affect you in this. This is why we need to pivot. Once again, don't give definite yes or no's on things you don't know about. People understand that you're not going to have all the answers up front, and just make sure that you're informing the client that to solve these problems it might take more research, or if they've got extra ideas for extra features into the games, let them know that it's something you'll be looking into, not necessarily something that is guaranteed to happen until it's written down and it's in paper. Give yes or no's on things that you are 100% certain of. If they ask you, oh, is this in the build, and it's definitely in the build, then yeah, it's in the build. You can definitely give them a yes or a no there kind of thing. But when they're asking for extra stuff that you haven't done yet, try and stay away from saying, yes, this will definitely go into the game. And then, yeah, so don't present problems without potential solutions. So that kind of harkens back to what I was saying earlier. If you do present a problem to a client, it's not their job to solve that problem for you. It's your job to be solving that problem for them. But what you want to do is you want to be presenting them options to solve that problem and let them choose that. So then the responsibility falls back on them for which way the project is going. You don't want to be making too many changes without them knowing about it, and that's a good way to keep them in the loop. So it was only a short-term presentation, but in summary, make sure you've got your mobile portfolio, so you've got a portfolio on you at any given point in time. Always dress to impress. Make sure that you're always treating every interaction with a client like an interview. I know sometimes you might run into a client anywhere and you might be in casual clothes. That's fine, but for your set interviews, try and make sure you're dressing to impress them. Your third one, don't talk money in your first meeting. It isn't a good practice. It's something that you don't really want to be doing straight off the bat. You do want to be building those connections first, because your long-term work, your future work comes off of what connections you build rather than how much you're actually making them cost. Don't present problems without solutions. I just kind of went over that. So that's really important so that the client isn't thinking that they need to solve all of your problems on top of the problems that they've already got that they need to solve. Be transparent with the whole process. I find that this really helps, that if you go to the client and as soon as something's looking like it's going to take a little bit extra time, chuck them an email or a text going, hey, it's looking like this particular element's going to take a bit of time, and it's really important to just be transparent about all of that throughout the whole process. I know that's not something I really touched on much in the presentation. I didn't really find where it fitted into meetings in particular, but if you're transparent throughout the process, you build a better connection with the client, essentially. And then finally, the biggest one is be confident. You'll lose so many jobs if you're not being confident in these interactions, and confidence is key in a lot of this. In a lot of situations where you might find yourself saying no to a project, it's better to kind of fake it till you make it in that regard, where you're saying, yes, I will look into that. I am confident that my skills may be able to transfer into that field, where you can then do a bit of research and maybe find an opportunity to better yourself even if you're not going forward with that particular project. So that's pretty much it from me. Does anybody have any kind of questions, anything that they want kind of clarified from that talk?
I suppose with the technical language you use with the client, do you change, I suppose, how you might discuss with the client depending on their knowledge?
Yes.
So, for example, I know you as you mentioned, you do work with VR Adelaide. Do you sort of find just getting more into technical nitty-gritty with them than you would say with Bunnings?
That's a really interesting point, because the person one of the people we work with VR Adelaide, you would think that they would know a lot in terms of VR, in terms of what's being put into it, but one of the people we work with, and it tends to be the people with money, that really they're not 100% sure on all the background stuff. Like one of the guys we worked with, a good example is we spoke to him about 3D modeling, and his understanding of 3D modeling was that you drew the same thing from 100 different angles, and that's how you put it into the game. Like you would think someone that works in VR that interacts with 3D models almost on a daily basis would understand that there's a little bit more to the process. Well, I guess there's a little bit less to the process than that. But that's not how things are done. So you kind of want to dynamically change things as you're going, and you want to feedback off of your client. It is bad to make assumptions initially about what they know. So it's good to start at that kind of really high level information where you're talking as if they knew nothing. And then as they kind of understand a little bit more, as you grow to know that they understand a little bit more, then you can start getting into those more itty-gritty conversations with them. So, yeah. Anything else?
Go on. What would you recommend as practice for someone who's spent a lifetime being awkward as fuck?
What do you mean?
Just for like interacting with clients and stuff.
Oh.
A lot of the time when it's like the thing I was talking about, trying to establish somebody's competency. You don't want to be condescending, but at the same time, you don't want to make them feel stupid.
No, so the way I discuss this with my artist quite a bit, because he used to come along to client meetings with me, and he didn't do the game design course, so a lot of taking down those technical terms was difficult for him. The way we kind of did it was essentially you answer the question almost as directly as possible. So if they say, I'm trying to think of an example now. If they say, how would you make a game, I'm thinking Indiana Jones, about running away from a boulder rolling down a hill. Well, you're not going to go into the technical terms talking about physics and raycasts and creating a force behind the boulder. You'll just go, yep, so we'll have a function in the game that when you press a button or when the player decides they want to start the game, then the boulder will start rolling down the hill. So you're essentially almost repeating their question back to them, and then when they ask you to elaborate, then that's your opportunity to slowly start layering the information in. And after a few sessions with a client, you should be good enough mates with them, at the very least, that you understand what level you need to go into immediately. But yeah, so for your first interaction, just try and assume that they know nothing, and just talk as direct and answer the question as directly as you can, essentially. I know there was a question over here, Kathy.
If VR infrastructure is very light on, what do you do when you have a client that might be interested but doesn't have the equipment?
So that's when you can kind of discuss with them how they could go about getting the equipment. So we've had a client that doesn't have VR equipment that's been interested in VR. For example, we did the Gaimbara Festival. We made a game for them at the beginning of the year. It's an Indigenous festival. That was a great networking thing we got. That's how we got our connections with NAC and Napa. But they didn't have any VR set up. So, I mean, it's a bit different with an event where we were able to take our stuff down. But you could present the opportunity to them where you go, hey, well, this is where we got our VR stuff from, and just kind of recommend to them brands, I guess, talk through them, this is how much it costs, and make sure that, if I go back, you're being transparent with them about how much things will cost if they want to take a virtual reality approach. And then it might be the point where you're pivoting straight away, where they might want something VR, but it's too costly. So you go, well, does everyone in your company have a mobile phone? It might be worth looking at a mobile app instead, or it might be worth looking at working with something on a computer if that's too expensive, or like looking at and brainstorming other options for them, but being transparent about the cost of everything up front. Anything else? Anybody else have any questions? No? Awesome. Well, if you guys do have anything that you think of later, feel free to come and ask me. If you Google Classy Bogan Studios, we are the first website that comes up. Look us up on Facebook. If you want a business card from me, grab one from me just after this, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions anybody might have in that regard. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.